people to try to prevent it spreading, but the uptake on using those seems to have been appalling, like under 50%. So clearly the voluntary approach isn't working, and maybe we need to try something else.
Heather?
Yeah, well, it is terrible. I'd hate to see the kauri die out, but people love the great outdoors, and it is a shame that they won't comply with these things that might actually make a difference. If they're really going to die, does the council have much option?
Here is a real contrarian view, and it has provoked fury. Alex Prion, the famed evolutionary biologist, founder of the Prion Lab, argues in the Washington Post that species die. That's how evolution works. 99.9% of all species that have ever lived, as many as 50 billion, have already become extinct. We shouldn't moan the loss of them. We don't have to agonise about giant snails and green frogs. The only species we should save is us. And this is a man who's rescued endangered species himself, but says we're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction. It's crazy to perform ultrasound on rhinos. We don't need to worry about polar bears on ice floes. The impulse to conserve for conservation's sake has taken on an unnecessary urgency. Conserving a species we have helped to kill off, but on which we are not directly dependent, discharges our own guilt, but little else. Extinction, the engine of evolution. Can you think of any arguments against this? He's basically saying it doesn't matter, other forms come back. It mightn't be the kauri tree, it mightn't be the nice polar bear, but there'll be something.
Maybe just mould, you know. I mean, it's certainly a provocative point of view, but I don't think, you know, the planet Earth has quite seen an extinction event like this one, where you know, certainly entire subspecies are vanishing, and we're sort of focusing on a few others. For example, if you look at just even plant species, you know, the forms of wild corn have all basically vanished, and now we just have this basically one variety that's planted all the way around the world. Yeah. And there's a real risk if you don't maintain that biodiversity. You know, what happens if the right, or I guess wrong, sort of virus or bacteria breaks out? It could decimate the entire Earth.
Yeah, that's a very germane argument.
And so we need some. There is strength in species diversity, and deciding it doesn't matter. I think it seems a bit blasé.
The world is a bit blasé, but you know, survival of the fittest, and sometimes we interfere quite inappropriately. I mean, I think everybody probably remembers the snails on the west coast that Doc decided needed to be saved, and they moved all sorts of things in order to do so, only to find that there were far too many of them in the final instance. So we do have to be a bit careful about how we interfere.
Okay, so you're a bit closer to his point of view than Matt. The world is no better or worse for the absence of saber-toothed tigers and dodo birds and our Neanderthal cousins. He quotes the authors of a recent National Academy of Sciences paper pointing out that species richness has shown no net decline among plants over 100 years across 16,000 sites. It is an interesting debate. And there have been many interesting topics that we've talked about today and debated. Heather Roy, thank you. Nice to have you on.
Thank you.
Come back again. And
thank you.
Matt Nippert has been on too. Thank you, Matt. Always nice to see you.
No worries, Jim.
That's us for another day. We are back tomorrow as usual. Thanks, everybody. And Checkpoint with John Campbell's on the way.
Kia ora everyone. Tonight on Checkpoint we have just received a statement from the Minister of Health. Director General of Health resigns. Health Minister Dr David Clark has announced the resignation of Director General of Health Chai Chua. I'm advised by the State Services Commission that an acting Director General of Health will be appointed shortly. This is just happening. We're desperately trying to get reaction and explanation, although we think we can guess a little bit of what's behind it. Also tonight, the water crisis in Napier. How short are they? A crisis in terms of people who are able to work in the aged care sector. Thousands desperately needed. And the Health Minister responds to an interview from a mother whose boys died of synthetics use. She says the system is broke. He says he agrees with her.
RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Good afternoon, I'm Anna Thomas. Napier could run out of water very soon if water restrictions are ignored. The City Council says reservoir water is critically low. Other places around the country are also imposing restrictions as temperatures soar past 30 degrees in some regions. This report from Anne-Marie May.
Napier residents are being told to only use water for drinking, cooking and washing. The City Council has also banned car washing and the watering of gardens. It says people have been using far more water than usual because of the hot weather. In Otago, the taking of water for irrigation from the Tairi River has been stopped and restrictions are in place on two other rivers, the Pomahaka and Kakanui, as they drop towards minimum levels. Water restrictions are also in force in Hanma Springs, while a ban on residential sprinklers and irrigation systems in Wellington remains in place. This is Anne-Marie May.
The Director General of Health is stepping down early from the job. Chai Chua made the announcement a short time ago, saying his last day on the job will be February the 2nd. He said it's been his view that the health system needs to tackle the challenges ahead as one team. Mr Chua has acknowledged that while significant progress has been made in shifting the system forward, it has not been without controversy. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, says Labour and New Zealand First are not at odds over plans to get young people into work. The Regional Economic Development Minister, Shane Jones, says he wants to get young unemployed people, quote, off the couch, and is proposing what he calls a work for the dole scheme. He admits not all of his cabinet colleagues see eye to eye with him on this proposal. National says the debate over the idea highlights how far apart all the parties in government are. But Ms Ardern says that's not the case.
We've called it ready to work. Minister Jones has talked about work for the dole. We're essentially talking about the same thing. The reason we've used a different title is some people have confused what we're proposing with the schemes of old.
Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. NIWA has issued red alerts for king tides for all of the country for the whole week because of what's known as a supermoon. The moon will be at its closest to Earth tonight, so it'll look larger than usual. NIWA says tides normally peak 1 to 2 days after a new moon or full moon. Some Auckland ferry services won't sail this week because of the tidal effect. Auckland Transport says buses will replace the service between downtown and Half Moon Bay on Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday afternoons. An Australian MP has proposed to his long-term partner in Parliament shortly after the same-sex marriage bill was introduced into the House of Representatives. Tim Wilson, who's been engaged to his partner Ryan Bolger for 9 years, restated his proposal during a speech on the legislation this morning. Mr Wilson became emotional when paying tribute to Mr Bolger, thanking him for his trust and for standing beside him during his political career.
This debate has been the soundtrack to our relationship. So there's only one thing left to do. Ryan Patrick Bolger, will you marry me?
Tim Wilson. And the members' bill is expected to pass easily sometime this week, having already been passed by the Senate. The government will introduce urgent legislation this week to assist with the rebuild of the Christchurch Cathedral. The cathedral was devastated by the Christchurch earthquakes almost 7 years ago and has lain fenced off, propped up by metal supports in the city centre ever since. A luxury tourist train is set to be travelling nearly the length of New Zealand in 2 years' time. In a joint venture between Antipodean Explorer New Zealand and a Chinese company, Fuwa, 31 former Auckland commuter carriages are being converted into a rolling hotel. The co-founder and general manager of the project, Amanda Johnston, says the train will be able to carry 56 passengers.
The train is 16 carriages long. We will have space for 56 guests. We'll also have 2 dining carriages, 2 lounge carriages and an observation car. So the guests will eat and sleep on board the train.
Amanda Johnston says the venture has been 7 years in the making. It's at 5:04. The New Zealand cricket captain Kane Williamson has praised his bowlers after a dominant win in the first test against the West Indies in Wellington. The Black Caps this afternoon completed victory by an innings and 67 runs with a day and a half to spare. The tourists began the day on 214 for 2 but could only add a further 104. Williamson says his bowlers showed their adaptability in the second innings.
At 200 for 2, I thought the bowlers were exceptional to change their tact of thought, to play the long game, be patient with how they operated, and we saw the rewards later on or into the sort of second session today, so it was a great effort with the ball in hand.
Kane Williamson, and the second and final test starts in Hamilton on Saturday. Meanwhile, a short time ago, England was struggling at 62 for 3 early on day 3 of the second Ashes test against Australia in Adelaide. Australia made 442 for 8 declared in their first innings. The New Zealand men's pursuit team have won gold at the Track Cycling World Cup in Canada. The 4 riders, with an average age of under 20, beat the host nation in today's final to claim New Zealand's second gold for the event. And the New Zealand basketballer Stephen Adams has followed up a career-best NBA performance with an impressive 19-point haul today to help the Oklahoma City Thunder beat the San Antonio Spurs 90-87. And that's the news.
Kicked out of Australia.
I think it's unfair and it's unjust. I'll be alright, but it's difficult with separating from the family and friends and job and all that.
Locked up in New Zealand.
That's what a prison does. You don't get sent to prison unless you cause harm to others.
And lying on the couch.
What we do support is the creation of decent work options for people who are unemployed, so they no longer have to go and look for work that doesn't exist. I think the way he's portraying sitting on the couch is unhelpful.
Get your act together with Guy on Aspinall and Kim Hill. Morning Report weekdays from 6.
Then on 9 to noon, gamers fight back against the so-called gamblification of video games as loot boxes increase, prompting governments to consider regulation. And after 10, author of All the Light We Cannot See, Anthony Dewar, on crafting a bestseller and convincing publishers to take a gamble. Join me, Catherine Ryan, on 9 to noon after Morning Report on RNZ National.
And now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. For all of the North Island, mainly fine and warm, but isolated afternoon and evening showers from Taupō northwards. Also a few areas of cloud or fog tomorrow morning. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller, Northern Westland, Canterbury and Otago, mainly fine and warm, but isolated showers in Otago tomorrow afternoon. Southern Westland, Fiordland and Southland, patchy rain about Fiordland and Stewart Island. Spreading elsewhere today, rain possibly heavy in Fiordland for a time tomorrow with a few falls elsewhere. And for the Chatham Islands, fine and cloudy periods. RNZ National, it's 5:07 and you're listening to Checkpoint with John Campbell.
And it's all on for young and old. Thanks, Anna Thomas. Nice to have you with us. Gosh, last week we were beginning the program and Bob Simcox stood down as the head of the Waikato DHB. Today, even further up the food chain, the Director General of Health has resigned. Health Minister Dr David Clark acknowledges the resignation of Director General of Health Chai Chua. This is a quote in the media release from David Clark. David Clark is not talking. I'd like to thank him for his public service as Director General of Health since November 2013, and I respect his decision to finish earlier. Earlier this year, Mr Chua came under fire for his part in a funding allocations botch-up, which saw 14 DHBs given too much funding, while 6 DHBs were shortchanged. Almost 40 million as assigned incorrectly across the country, including almost 3 million at the Canterbury DHB. One of the board members on the Canterbury DHB is Jo Kane. She called for Mr Chua's resignation in June, and she joins us now live. Are you there, Jo?
Yes, hi John.
Hello, nice to talk to you.
Oh yeah, well it's look, what happens on these health boards is you're usually not allowed to talk, and nobody ever does, and so what has gone on for such a long period of time is kind of swept under the counter.
Okay.
But I'm kind of sick of it, so I'm quite happy to talk.
Right, well you're live on air, so we're delighted about that. Thank you so much. Can we talk about the particular and the thing that really got your back up, which was the funding era, and it was a disaster really, and also the response to it. What was at stake when you called for Chai Chua to resign in June?
Well, it was a chapter of events. Don't forget that the MOH and their financials of their own building were found very short, of which he led. But for me, it was a last straw in the engagement and the leadership that he was meant to show for Canterbury. And it was just like, how can you be stomping all over us and yet you know, you need to have a good look in the mirror, is what I felt. And I haven't had any confidence, that I'm talking to me, in that leadership or the relationship that we had with him. And it's very, very interesting that David Clark, that's exactly words that he's used.
Can you explain that? Sorry, your line's dropping out a bit.
If you look at the press release,
yeah,
he's saying that what is needed is actually leadership and relationships. Well, it was more to do with the relationships and the partnership that health boards should have with the MOH. And, you know, for us in Canterbury, it's the lack of that engagement for years and years. And it's almost if you're in, you win. If you're not, you struggled.
Okay,
and
now have you been?
That's just what happened.
But my sense, and anyone who listens to Checkpoint regularly will know, we've spent an enormous amount of time covering the DHBs, the position they're in, the relationship with the minister, the relationship with the ministry. My sense is that across the board, almost without exception, although there are a couple of DHBs who will contradict me, there has been an increasingly tense relationship between DHBs, our major hospitals, and the ministry under Chai Chua. Is that your sense of it?
Absolutely, that's exactly. And all we really asked, I mean, I'm an elected official, all we asked was come to the table, look at the data, and explain to us why you keep seeing things that are so at odds with us. But then when you look around the country, John, there are other health boards, and what they do is they played winners and losers. As I said, if you were in, you won. So if you were on side with the ministry and everything, you got your funding. If you weren't, of which we happen to be one, but we're not the only one, you just hit a brick wall. And I you know, my kind of thought on this was when chief executives are in such powerful positions, I wondered what was he advising on behalf of Canterbury to the then minister, and I'm not convinced that it was correct.
How much pressure were you under in terms of the KPIs around fiscal performance?
Almost out the door pressure. We have been threatened. That is what come back, is that the board will be dismissed. We've had financial reviews with PwC, and even though there were figures in there that were incorrect, that we've had to have a second review, that actually found us financially sustainable. So a lot of the rhetoric that happened around Canterbury is really simple, John, and this is what I find so irritating. There's a funding model, and it's either good, you know, it's what we all work under. We're just asking in Canterbury for our fair share. Forget the earthquakes, all right? Just forget the earthquakes. Just give us what our population-based funding is. And, you know, we threw our stats at them, and we got a different answer. And that's not how it works.
I've just got a statement here from the State Services Commissioner, Peter Hughes. You're right about the language that David Clark used. It's sort of repeated here. I'm just reading through it at high speed. But Peter Hughes says, Mr Chair advised me at the end of July that he was considering stepping down before the end of his term. I guess he would have anticipated the possibility for a change of minister, because he seems to have been strongly aligned with Jonathan Coleman and might have reasonably had the expectation that he wouldn't have been as close to whoever the next minister might have been. But that's hypothesis by me. But Peter Hughes goes on, he has long held the view that it is critical that the health sector is unified in meeting the challenges ahead. Are you saying that you don't think Chai Chua was unifying the health sector?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, I'm not isolated here in Canterbury. I talk to other board members around the country, and I tell you, that's the key elements that I think were missing: leadership, relationships, and a partnership. So we should be in a partnership. So you should be able to explain, hey, here's a problem that we've got, and not actually, it's almost combative with the behaviour back from that, you know, it's not just size. There's a team there that, in my opinion, it's like, well, I hope there's going to be a little bit of a little soul searching in there, because it's just not good enough for the rest of the country.
Joe Kane, who made the highly unusual move of calling for Chai Chua to resign in June and is one of the few people prepared to speak on the record today. Thank you so much, Joe, who is a board member of the Canterbury District Health Board. Obviously, Peter Hughes has put out a statement, the State Services Commissioner, the Health Minister, David Clark, has put out a statement. We really would love to talk to them, because they are saying this is part of an evolutionary process, that Chai Chua has done good work, but it is time to move on. We'd like to hear that from the horse's mouth, really, Peter Hughes or Dr. David Clark. We'd really like it if you were available to join us on Checkpoint. Chai Chua himself. We have been covering DHBs at length over the past few months, and we have heard from DHB after DHB that there is a very tense relationship between what they call Wellington and the district health boards throughout the country. We would like to talk about this in the context of Chai Chua's resignation. It's 5:15. You're with Checkpoint on RNZ. That news just breaking. Turn off your tap. That's the message to Napier residents from the council as the reservoirs reach a critical level after sizzling temperatures around the country this week. And residents have been warned the town could run out of water as soon as tonight if strict water restrictions aren't adhered to. The Napier Mayor is Bill Dalton, and he's just been briefed on the situation.
Well, the situation is that our reservoirs are, to be honest, critically low, and we need to restrict watering of gardens and lawns and things to allow our reservoirs time to build up.
So outside of showers, loos, laundry and drinking, there's a total water ban?
Absolutely there is, yep. Apart from essential water, it's banned.
You use, in Napier's, 570 litres per person per day. That's high water usage, isn't it?
Well, it's right up there. As far as I'm aware, it's the highest in New Zealand. The average is just over 300 litres per person per day throughout New Zealand. So we are simply not conserving water, and all our problems would go away if we just reduced our consumption to the national average.
Have you been caught out by this? It does seem to have become critical rather quickly. In other words, should there have been water usage advisories issued earlier?
No. Look, normally overnight our reservoirs recharge. On Sunday night, for the first time, it didn't. Our reservoirs didn't recharge. So clearly, Sunday was a hell of a hot day here in Napier, and clearly people left their sprinklers on overnight, probably went out and put their sprinklers on in the afternoon and then went out for a barbecue and forgot about them. And we just had, instead of our reservoirs recharging, they actually ran down further overnight.
Okay.
It's incredible.
So are you in danger of actually running out of drinking water?
No,
Okay.
no, we're not going to do that. And we've got a couple of our bores which are offline at the moment, and the DHB has given us permission to put them back online. So, look, we're going to get through this, but at the moment, all we're asking people to do is to conserve water because, as I say, if we could get back to the national average, we'd be sweet. Okay,
you need some rain, don't you? And that's not forecast.
No. Look, we're told it's going to be a hot, dry summer. So, it's going to be an ongoing issue because we're seeing these different weather patterns that we've had before. So, if we have these long, hot, dry spells, and everybody wants a green lawn and they want their plants to continue to grow, so they water them. Well, they're just not going to be able to do that if we want to maintain. One of the biggest issues is maintaining firefighting capacity,
yeah.
And so we don't want to get to the stage where we can't do that.
Right, so people can't use water outside, and also, obviously, they can't light fires outside.
No, exactly right. I mean, it's the last thing we want is a fire to start and have to use huge amounts of water to put it out. So, look, it's a case, John, of people just being sensible.
You need some spending on water infrastructure there, don't you? I know you're Napier, and the Havelock North bore disaster was in the Hastings area under a completely different mayor and council. But water is becoming an issue in Hawke's Bay, isn't it?
Well, water's becoming an issue in the world. Look, at the end of the day, every century goes through where there are certain golden products. And, we went through a century where it was coal, we went through a century where it was oil. Now it's water, and we need to conserve water. We need to regard it as a treasure, and we need to conserve it.
Napier Mayor Bill Dalton, do turn your taps off if you are in Napier. But it's not just in Napier where the hot water is causing headaches and problems. The mercury topped 30 degrees in some parts of the country, with highs of 31 in Alexandra and Clyde. That's in central, of course. Farmers say the early heat could spell a drought. Sally Murphy filed this report.
2, 1, go!
A hot day in Wellington meant plenty of people took advantage of the waterfront.
I've been inside studying all day for an exam and just thought it would be really nice to go for a dip.
Yeah, just taking a break from studying, so we thought we'd come jump off the platform and the plank on the waterfront to cool down. Just swimming. We were in town for the day, so we're just jumping in the water because it's nice. It's a lot warmer than you'd expect, actually.
But it's not good news for everyone. The hot and dry weather also means vineyards are seeing a bounty, but some are struggling to find enough workers to cope with the workload. In North Canterbury, farmers are worried they could fall back into drought. Mike Bowler, who runs nearly 2,000 sheep on his farm near Cheviot, is concerned about how quickly things are drying off.
Because we had such a wet winter, the ground is caked hard on top, and although I think there's probably still moisture well down, it's actually struggling to get up through the hard pan now. Everything's drying off, everything's gone to seed, starting to look very brown around the place.
Mr Bowler says farmers are well prepared, but with temperatures this warm at the start of the summer, feed stocks could disappear quickly. Met Service meteorologist Hannah Mose says a ridge of high pressure across the country is causing the hot, dry conditions.
Comparing temperatures this year to last year, this year we're in the late 20s to early 30s, whereas at the start of summer last year temperatures were in the mid to late teens.
Miss Mose says the temperature will drop slightly on Wednesday along the east coast, but the hot dry weather should last all week. NIWA meteorologist Ben Knoll says seas are also warmer than usual.
The average sea surface temperature anomaly, or the difference from average, is about 2 degrees Celsius, but in some locations along the west coast of New Zealand, South Island, as warm as 6 degrees above average for the time of year. So a very impressive warmth unfolding across the marine environment.
Mr Knoll says the higher temperatures are caused by La Nina, an ocean atmosphere phenomenon. He says the rising temperatures will be good for beachgoers and ice cream sellers, but it's concerning for the environment.
Yeah, it's not all good in the grand scheme of things. We live on a warmer planet now than we did, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago. So in the background, you have climate change, which is increasing our temperatures just a little bit in the long-term trend.
For Checkpoint, Sally Murphy.
The aged care sector is warning of a looming crisis unless the government relaxes immigration laws and starts planning for the future. The former national government changed immigration laws in April this year so that workers in jobs considered low skills, like aged care, have to go elsewhere for 1 year every 3 years. It's a stand-down period of sorts, and it means the aged care sector could lose a third of its staff by April 2020 because around a third of its workers are migrants. Zach Fleming has more.
We're on the cusp of a significant increased demand for aged care.
What I need the new minister to understand is we will have a crisis on our hands in 3 years.
Lee Keegan's been the HR manager for St Andrews Village in Auckland for a decade.
I will lose 35% of my staff in 3 years' time. They will all have to leave New Zealand, which is, to me, the most insane piece of legislation I can think of.
Staff like Ed Badamo, who's been working at St Andrews for 12 years, since 2005.
That's scary, because my whole family is here, you know, me, my wife, my children, and now my grandson. We're all here. We belong here. But it's just the acceptance that, you know, that is missing.
Under immigration rules brought in by the former national government in April, he now has to spend a year outside of New Zealand every 3 years, because aged care is classed as a low-skilled job. The new rule is one of a raft of problems identified in a new Salvation Army report out today, which recommends aged care workers' skill status is changed.
And it's got to be something that's innate. We can train people how to do things. What we can't train people is to have the heart, the soul and the attitude that allows you to sit quietly with someone as they take their last breath, or have a conversation with someone with advanced dementia.
And there doesn't seem to be enough born and bred New Zealanders who want to do that. Only a fifth of St Andrews healthcare assistants were born here.
I've only had one New Zealander apply in the last 3 years.
And she says that was a 73-year-old who only works 2 shifts a week. The Immigration Minister, Ian Lees-Galloway, says he's had concerns with the national government's changes ever since they were announced.
What we are committed to doing is ensuring that where genuine skill shortages exist, that employers will be able to use immigration to get the people that they need. I'm determined that the aged care sector will get the people that they need to provide the care for our ageing population.
He says the Health Minister, David Clark, who's yet to respond to questions from Checkpoint, hasn't raised it with him directly.
But it is an issue that I'm well aware of. representatives of the aged care sector are coming to meet me soon, and I'm looking forward to having a fruitful conversation with them.
And alongside the immigration issues, the Salvation Army report says demand for aged care may rise as much as 40% over the next decade, meaning the sector may need nearly 20,000 more workers. And that's on current levels. It doesn't take into account what may happen 3 years from now. The Army's social policy analyst Alan Johnson is urging the government to start planning for the future.
So that we can make certain that we do sufficient recruitment and training of New Zealand resident workers as well as migrants. So we don't see migrants as being the answer to this issue. We see it as being a balance.
The Immigration Minister says any changes he brings in that would help the aged care sector would be brought in at the same time as other planned changes to immigration.
It may be a little while before we make changes in this area, but we are actively reviewing it. I've heard very loudly the concerns that people have with the policies of the previous government, and we're actively working on them right now.
He has until April 2020. For Checkpoint, Zach Fleming.
The Health Minister, David Clark, is still yet to respond. His office earlier today told us we were getting a statement. Obviously, they've been busy accepting Chai Chua's resignation, but we would love to hear from the Minister on that, so we'll try again tomorrow. Shane Jones is planting trees and making waves. During an interview on TVNZ's Q&A programme on Sunday morning, he said he told his, quote, young ne'er-do-well nephews that there'll be no more sitting on the couch. Shane Jones has called it work for the dole. The response from the government and its supporters has been to add some nuance in there. Genuine work for a genuine wage, said Jacinda Ardern on Morning Report. Richard Wagstaff from the CTU said they don't support people being coerced to work for the dole, but they do support the creation of decent work options for people who are unemployed. Now, we wanted more opinions from the north. Tomorrow we'll talk to young people themselves. Our reporter is currently there. But Mana Party leader Hone Harawira, a former Taitaukere MP who went to Parliament to achieve change for Māori, well, what does he think of what Shane Jones is saying, particularly because they're related and they have nephews in common?
Yeah, his mum and dad's place is about a kilometre away from my house, so we're quite closely related, and so, of course, all of his nephews are my nephews, and, I see them all the time. I went down to a tangi down East Coast last week with Shane's son and another one of the nephews, so, the relationships are ongoing.
So he's described them as ne'er-do-well neffs sitting on the couch doing nothing. Is that how you see them?
Yeah, look, not all of them, John, but I made it plain, for the last 2 or 3 elections as the mana leader, that I'm a great fan of community employment, that if the private sector's not ready to step up, then the government needs to step up by providing community employment projects to get the brothers off the couch. That was how I talked about it. Shane, of course, is referring to our nephews, but I'm talking about men generally. I just want to see them get off the couch and don't, I hear the unions are complaining about, it's got to be meaningful work and real work, but they don't live up here. I live up here, and I see boys doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing while their maraes are suffering, while schools are suffering, while old people's homes could do with a bit of paint and more lawns being mowed, while schools could have fences fixed, all that kind of stuff. There's so much that can be done in terms of community work, and all our kids need is the opportunity to get back into work. Once they do, they will challenge themselves. They'll say, hell, I can be better than this. I can do better than... And they themselves will start to look for big opportunities. So, I'm a big fan of getting our kids back to work in the communities in which they live.
You say getting our kids back to work. Shane Jones is talking about work for the dole. That's not what you're describing. You're describing jobs, aren't you?
Well, back in the day, John, and you remember them, they used to have these project employment programs, PEPs, where you got, for about 6 months or maybe 9 months, you get together a supervisor, a builder of some sort, some of the local boys that get some money for like paint, for scrapers, shovels and that for helping dig out drains and all that, and clean fence lines, all that kind of stuff. And, 20, what would it have been, 30 odd years ago, John, when I was running this trust I'm back on with now, We did up 15 maraes on PEP projects.
And who funded that?
And,
Who funded
that? It was
that?
funded by the government. That was funded by the government under the PEP scheme. It was the Department of Labour back then. I guess it's WINS, MSD now, but the same structure was used to get our people back to work. And then, when the private sector picks up, you've got people who sniff work, who understand work, who are ready to work. But you just can't take a young man who doesn't even know what work is, because not only has he never seen work in his lifetime, neither have his parents, if he's got two parents living in the same house. So, it's intergenerational now, and even grandparents, they haven't seen real work for a long, long time. So you have to try and get them engaged in the work that they understand, and that might just be around their marae. It might be, if they're a young fella and they've got kids at kohanga or at preschool, they always need somebody to help out, mowing the lawns, painting the fences. It doesn't really matter what it is. Just get them back to work. Get them off the couch, back to work.
So what are they doing now?
Well, according to the stats, we've got more than 2,500 in the Taituka. They're sitting around doing nothing. Some of them, causing some serious trouble. A lot of them just seriously depressed. They can't see a future for themselves. I just come from watching a play, actually, called Tether, where they were talking about depression and, kid growing up and not respected by his father, and then the father leaves, all that kind of stuff. It's very much the life of a lot of our young people, and we have to give them something positive, and we have to challenge ourselves to step outside the boundaries. And like Shane says, get them off the bloody couch, get them to work. Now, I know that Shane's taken a bit of a kick up the backside about the Work for the Dole. It's a work-ready program, I understand, that Labour was talking about. It's they're talking community employment. That's exactly the program I was talking about, at this election and at the last election. Community employment, when unemployment is high, community employment is the way to go to keep everybody engaged and to help rebuild your community, refresh your community, make your community beautiful again.
Right, you see, I listen to you saying this stuff, and you're not using the same incendiary language that Shane Jones uses. And I wonder if you're playing to different constituencies. I wonder if Shane Jones is playing to a New Zealand First constituency and you're in fact playing to the Māori community in the north. In other words, when he talks, it sounds punitive. When you talk, things start to sound possible. They start to sound meaningful. They start to sound like they have a value.
Yeah, well, Shane's always been a bit of a dick that way. No, not really. Not really. Look, I don't really care who he's talking to, but even my wife Hilda, I said, watch this. She watched Shane's Q&A interview. She said, I like that. I like that, getting the boys off the couch, keeping them challenged, making them move forward.
Hana Harawira talking to us a short time ago. You are with Checkpoint on RNZ, and thank you for being with us. Coming up on the program, last week we spoke to Natasha Sadler, the mother of a 23-year-old with schizophrenia who became addicted to synthetics and was killed by them. An extraordinary response to that interview, by the way, 65,000 viewings of it on our Facebook page alone. And among the people who heard us say addiction support is woefully inadequate in New Zealand was the new health minister. Tonight, coming up, he tells us he totally agrees with her. Also coming up, an ambitious plan's been unveiled to run an Orient Express-style luxury train through New Zealand. Nona has business news next, but before it all, with the time at 25.5 to 6. Here's the headlines. Anna Thomas.
Thanks, John. Napier could run out of water tonight if water restrictions are ignored. The City Council's infrastructure manager, John Kingsford, says reservoir water is the lowest it's been in recent years because of heavy usage in the hot weather. And the taking of water for irrigation from Otago's Tairi River has been stopped as dry weather lowers water levels in the region's rivers. And water restrictions are also enforced in Hanmer Springs and Wellington. The Director General of Health is stepping down early from the job. Chai Chua came under fire earlier this year for his part in a funding allocations bodge-up, which saw some DHBs given too much funding while others were shortchanged. Canterbury DHB board member Joe Kane called for his resignation earlier this year, and tonight has told Checkpoint the ministry under his leadership played winners and losers with health boards. The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says Labour and New Zealand First are not at odds over plans to get young people into work. The Regional Economic Development Minister Shane Jones says he wants to get young unemployed people off the couch and is proposing what he calls a work for the dole scheme. NIWA has issued red alerts for king tides for the whole week because of what's known as a super moon. The moon will be at its closest to Earth tonight, so it'll look larger than usual. And NIWA says tides normally peak 1 to 2 days after a new moon or full moon. The government's introducing urgent legislation shortly to help with the rebuild of the Christchurch Cathedral. The building and spire were devastated by the Christchurch earthquakes almost 7 years ago and have lain fenced off, propped up by metal supports ever since. And today's search efforts for a 20-year-old Rangiora woman missing since late on Friday night will continue until sunset. A group of 45 volunteers and police are looking in and around the Ashley River near the town for Emma Beattie. And those are the headlines.
Thanks, Anna Thomas. Just if you're driving the Central North Island, serious crash on State Highway 1 near Taupō Motutere. One person has serious injuries. The southbound lane of the road is closed. Traffic management is in place. Delays are expected between Taupō and Turangi if you are in that neighbourhood at the moment. Nona is back this week with business news. Nice to have you back, Nona.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Surveys found most Kiwi savers don't take much interest in where their money's been invested.
I know, go figure, huh? Because there was a survey, and we've had a lot of conversations about this. One of them was about responsible investments. Should they be in funds that excluded things such as tobacco and arms?
Did a lot of work on
yes,
that. Yeah.
Exactly right.
Yep.
Well, it turns out a survey's been done, and yes, 44% of respondents, are concerned about where their money goes, but 56% really don't care at all. In fact, 16% didn't even want to know where their money was going, and 40% didn't care. And only 41% of the respondents actually preferred to have their money into funds which had environmental and social concerns.
16% didn't want to know.
They didn't want to know. No, they didn't even want to know.
Let's sell them some moon rock, Nona.
It seems very interesting that you would put your money into and not even pay any attention whatsoever or care to know where that money's going.
Who did the survey?
This was a Westpac survey, and they interviewed 1,000 Kiwi savers.
And so does that absolve Westpac from ethical investment?
Well, no, actually, the whole point of the survey was to show that they have these funds available and were people interested in them. It turns out an awful lot of people aren't. Yeah. And what does that mean? It's kind of an interesting thing. If you are a Kiwi saver and you're thinking you don't care, maybe you should go to that Kiwi saver tracker we talked about that the FMA with the Financial Markets Authority is offering up, because you really should be paying attention to where your money's going for the long-term savings plan that you have. And okay, so maybe you don't care if it's in a socially responsible fund, but you should care that it's in a fund that's giving you some kind of a return. Surely, come on.
You should care about all of it, Nona.
Well, it's your funds for long-term savings, right?
We must love one another or die, as Auden said.
If you say so, John.
No, it was Auden. Right, tech companies have turned a corner in delivering profitable growth. What does this mean for the market?
Well, that was interesting. So we did a roundup of companies that reported in the last sort of period, ended just in November. So these are companies that had year ends or half-year periods ending September 30th. Quite a lot of them were tech companies, young tech companies, including not so young ones like Xero, for example, that reported a maiden profit, which was a big deal. It was, $5.4 million. Not a lot of money, but it was a turning point. And others also indicated that they're going to be returning profits, which is, great news for their shareholders after a very long time of, making lots of losses. Well, in any case, we talked to some experts, and one of them said, well, even though all these tech companies are now starting to make a profit, it's not going to encourage a whole lot of new tech companies to list, because it's quite difficult to do so in terms of the requirements and the cost involved, and also shareholder reaction. We've talked about this before. Shareholders tend to really mark down companies that don't meet their expectations. Yeah. So right now the NZX, that's the New Zealand market operator, is reviewing listing rules, and there is some kind of hope that maybe that review will show a way forward for these smaller companies that really do struggle to get a foot in the door and then to grow profitably without necessarily good shareholder support. So I think times have changed. I think shareholders, according to some of the analysts, have a better sense now of what to expect from these tech companies and to be a little bit more patient with them perhaps, but also for the companies to manage shareholder expectations in a better way. Yeah.
Marcus, what did they do?
Well, actually, ours was slightly weaker, down 4 points to $8,185, trading at 68.6 US cents, 90.2 Australian and 50.9 pence. But that's mostly because the US dollar has gone up, with Donald Trump's tax package looking more likely than ever to make it pass a vote. So really good for corporates in the United States. They're going to reduce taxes, corporate tax, 35% down to 20%.
Nona Peltier, beside me in the Auckland studio. Thank you very much indeed, Nona. The Health Minister has responded to the mother of a 23-year-old man who died after failing to get treatment for his addiction to synthetic drugs by saying he agrees with her. Addiction services are underfunded and more treatment facilities are urgently needed. David Clark was responding to Natasha Sadler, whose son Memphis had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and who became addicted to synthetics as he tried to deal with the increasing terror of his psychotic episodes. The Minister has joined a long, loud chorus of people working in the field of drug and alcohol addiction, from clinicians to treatment centres to the Drug Foundation, who say they simply don't have the resources to cope. Natasha Sadler says she and Memphis witnessed that to his terrible cost.
And he said, I need help. And what was the reply to both he and I? There aren't any beds.
That's Natasha Sadler on Checkpoint last week. Memphis died 3 weeks ago. He was 23.
I did everything I could. There are insurmountable amount of meetings I attended with counsellors, with nurses, with doctors, with inpatient psychologists about getting my son help, and the only response I got was, there aren't enough beds.
There aren't any beds. We kept hearing that. And what compounds it is that people with alcohol or drug dependencies often have mental health issues too.
It's extremely difficult.
Roger Brooking, Clinical Manager, ADAC, Alcohol and Drug Assessment and Counselling.
When someone has both an addiction and an underlying mental health problem, which is the case in about 70% of these situations, you refer them to mental health and they say, we can't treat this person until they stop drinking or taking drugs. You refer them to alcohol and drug treatment and they say, we can't fix this person until his mental health gets sorted out.
It's a lose-lose, and the pressure it creates can be expressed in a very simple number. What is your waiting list now?
Currently today ours is around 140.
140 people?
Yeah.
That's Claire Aiken, Program Director at Moana House in Dunedin. Roger Brooking recently asked her how long it would take to clear that waiting list.
And she said, well, I could read you the email, it says 8 years.
But what compounds that, and almost makes it a theoretical calculation, is that they don't have 8 years. I didn't know that until I asked Claire Aiken what would help Moana House. As a residential care facility with a 140-person waiting list, what do they want?
Goodness, that's a big question. Having contracts that were secure, that weren't up after a year.
Sorry, I just want to interrupt there. Your contracts are 12 months at a time.
Well, some of them are, and some are 3 years, and all our contracts are up on the June the 30th next year.
So an acclaimed and successful program with a waiting list years long only has a guaranteed future of 7 months.
And unfortunately, with many of the DHBs being in serious financial strife, then addiction services are the ones that get cut. So we've had no funding increase for 9 years from anybody.
So, long waiting lists, service providers that can do addiction or mental health issues, but not both, and the pressures of stretched and uncertain funding.
So, I'm generalising, but frequently what happens as a result is that people just fall through the cracks.
Roger Brooking. Natasha Sadler watched her son fall through the cracks, although it wasn't a fall is quick. Memphis, who'd been so bright and optimistic as a teenager, descended.
He really was an amazing young man. If you speak to anybody about him, they'll tell you how wonderfully soft-hearted he was. Great big laugh. But his mental illness took a toll on the last 4 years of his life.
And he was formally diagnosed with schizophrenia.
Yes, he had to have a slow-release injection 3 weekly of paliperidone, which is an antipsychotic drug.
Psychosis induced by schizophrenia and drug dependency to self-medicate the psychosis. Memphis had mental illness and drug addiction. The lose-lose.
For the past 3 years, whilst I've been living in this home, part of our day-to-day routine was helping to keep our boy well and alive.
But they needed help, and they couldn't get it. Not enough help to save Memphis. Which brings us back to the terrible point at which we started.
And I said, please admit him. We need some help. He needs... And he was asking too. He was at the meeting. He's saying, I can't stop. It's got me by the throat. The people selling the stuff know it's got us by the throat too, and they don't care. They just want the money. And he said, I need help. And what was the reply to both he and I? There aren't any beds. That's not good enough. Make some beds, find some beds. My son died. That's the ultimate cost to pay. Will you listen now? Will they listen now?
Natasha Sadler, speaking on Checkpoint last week. The new health minister heard her.
Yeah, I agree with Natasha Sadler that there's a real need to increase our capacity for addiction services.
David Clark. There's been much discussion of this, of course.
It did become an election issue. Mental health and addictions was front and centre because I think most New Zealanders accept that we are not doing well enough. We've had a 60% increase in people putting themselves forward for support with mental health and addictions over the past decade, and yet funding has gone up by less than half of that over that past decade.
And those who know it say it isn't even a pure saving because money not spent on addiction services does get spent elsewhere. Prisons. What is the correlation between drug and alcohol dependency and criminality? How often do people who end up in jail have drug or alcohol issues?
Well, everybody probably knows all the stats that have been done, and it's very high, often around 76%.
And in fact, there was a Northland judge about a month ago who said that 80% of the cases before him are alcohol and methamphetamine related, and if we actually had dealt with those problems, people like him would be made redundant.
Ross Bell from the Drug Foundation, who's talking about District Court Judge Greg Davis, who said in September that up to 90% of the cases he hears in Northland involve people with addiction issues. Ross Bell says that's just bad economics. We spend money on prisons after people offend, but we won't spend money on treatment to stop people offending.
We give resources to the police, and then we give resources to the courts, and ultimately we end up building more prisons. But we never put money early into the problem around health, into prevention, education, and into treatment, and we leave it so long. So if a person isn't getting help, then we let the problems get worse and worse and worse.
And Claire Aiken says it's even more revealing than that. Alcohol and drug addiction is often a response to something. It comes first less often than it follows something. In other words, it can be a clear message that something has already gone seriously wrong.
Often the difficult life and struggles within whānau have started before the drug and alcohol abuse has started.
Exactly as with Memphis, Natasha Sadler's son. The schizophrenia came first, the drug addiction followed. Everyone knew he was in serious trouble and no one could help.
The only response I got was, there aren't enough beds. That's not good enough. What it means is we just need money put there. Stop building prisons. Stop building prisons. Build places where you can get our people well.
Natasha Sadler spoke to us because she wants something to change. And while he's the new minister, and incoming governments do tend to make reassuring noises, David Clark says he's listening to Natasha Sadler and to people like Claire Aitken, Roger Brooking and Ross Bell, who all believe the costs of inadequate treatment, lives lost, families damaged, crimes committed, prisons built, are far greater than the costs of treating people at risk.
Look, I think with our mental health inquiry, which we're launching within our first 100 days, we'll get plenty of feedback on the quality or not of addiction services and the importance of making sure that they are adequate for the need which is growing in our community.
David Clark, 10.5 to 6. Top Republicans in the US are warning President Trump that some of his latest tweets about the ongoing investigation into his campaign ties to the Russians are putting him in legal jeopardy. Over the weekend, the president was again tweeting up a storm, fueling speculation that he may have engaged in obstruction of justice when he fired the FBI Director James Comey earlier in the year. Mr. Trump described the FBI's reputation as in tatters, insisted he was the victim of a rigged system, and said he fired National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who last week pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI but has done nothing unlawful. Here's our US correspondent Simon Marks.
If anyone had any doubts about the danger Donald Trump's Twitter account poses for his presidency, they were finally dispelled this weekend. The president simply cannot help himself from expressing his stream of consciousness innermost fury on the social media platform. In 2 separate rants, with no filter, no off switch and no legal training, he reacted furiously to the news that his former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn pleaded guilty last week to lying to the FBI. The result of the latest stunning moves by the special prosecutor investigating ties between the Trump team and the Russians. At least one tweet fueled the suggestion that the president may have committed obstruction of justice, and it left top Republican Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina taking to the airwaves and begging Donald Trump to stop.
I would just say this to the president: there's an ongoing criminal investigation. Comey may be part of it. You tweet and comment regarding ongoing criminal investigations at your own peril. I'd be careful if I were you, Mr. President. I'd watch this.
Sensing the legal morass in which the president may have placed himself, the White House moved to argue that the tweet in question was written by his lawyer, not Mr. Trump himself. But the White House has previously argued the president's tweets are official presidential statements, and even published in his name, it would be just as legally perilous as if he'd written it himself. Behind the scenes, administration aides are panicked by Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller's relentless pursuit of his quarry and the president's response to it. But in public, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster is one member of the Trump team still pretending everything is fine.
We haven't missed a beat, really, and the topic doesn't even come up. I don't think our allies need any reassurance. In fact, what we're doing is continuing to work with them on all the key challenges we face today.
Which does not explain why the president's defense secretary in meetings at the Pentagon often refers to himself as the Minister for Reassurance. Donald Trump, by common consent, would be crazy ever to tweet again about the ongoing investigation into his campaign's affairs. Like every statement anyone in the United States makes, tweets can and will be used in evidence against him if a case is ever built.
And that was Simon Marks there from Washington. There have been touching and emotional scenes in the Australian Parliament today as the country's same-sex marriage legislation was introduced to the lower house. During the first stages of debate on the bill, Liberal MP Tim Wilson used his speech to publicly propose to his long-term partner. He'd actually been engaged to his schoolteacher partner, Ryan Bolger, for 9 years, but he restated his proposal and commitment as Mr Bolger sat in the public gallery.
And with the indulgence of the Speaker, the person I have to thank most is my partner, Ryan. You've had to tolerate more than most because you had to put up with me. Trust me. This debate has been the soundtrack to our relationship. We both know this issue isn't the reason we got involved in politics. Give us tax reform any day. But in my first speech, I defined our bond by the ring that sits on both of our left hands, and that they are the answer to the questions we cannot ask. So there's only one thing left to do. Ryan Patrick Bolger, will you marry me? We'll chuck that in the memoirs and Hansard.
Should let Hansard note to record that that was a yes, a resounding yes. Congratulations.
Thank you, Speaker.
Well done, mate.
Top action by the Speaker. Well done, mate. There was Tim Wilson's wonderful proposal to his partner in the Australian Parliament today. The Private Members Bill passed the Senate comfortably last week with all amendments rejected by the opposition and some Liberal senators. It's expected to easily pass the lower house sometime this week. We will obviously keep an eye on that. An ambitious plan's been unveiled to run an Orient Express-style luxury train throughout New Zealand. A local company with Chinese backing hopes to have the service running in 2 years' time, taking wealthy tourists through regional New Zealand with the train crossing the Cook Strait on the rail ferry, of course. The wraps came off the Antipodean Explorer at a New Zealand-China Mayoral Forum in Wellington. The journey will be pitched at the same class of rich tourists as other luxury trains in Europe, Canada and Asia. Todd Nile reports on the return of ritzy rail travel.
Let somebody else do the driving while you do the living.
It's been 38 years since a luxury sleeper train ran in New Zealand.
Relax. Silver Star between Auckland and Wellington.
The state-owned Silver Star, a purpose-built overnight express, ran from 1971 to 1979 before being withdrawn on cost grounds.
Let somebody else do the caring.
Attempts to convert it to partial seating ran into trouble when blue asbestos was found, and after lying idle for 12 years was sold, and now runs between Malaysia and Thailand as the Eastern and Oriental Express. Ironically, that's exactly the style of train planned to evolve from 31 former Auckland commuter carriages into the luxurious Antipodean Explorer.
It is essentially a moving hotel to take guests all over New Zealand to experience the very best of New Zealand in 1 week.
Amanda Johnson's the co-founder and general manager of Antipodean Explorer Limited, an idea that's been 7 years in the making. A 6-night journey from Auckland through most regions to Otago, linking to Queenstown by luxury coach.
We will stop for periods of between 2 and 5 hours every morning and every afternoon for our guests to enjoy the very best of New Zealand's tourism activities. So we've identified more than 75 businesses up and down the country to work with to provide that experience.
The train is a joint venture between local interests and the Chinese development company Fuwa, which is building a 5-star hotel on Auckland's waterfront. No cost or pricing's been made public. Fuwa's New Zealand Managing Director Richard Aitken says the train journey may frame further investment.
We're looking for further hotel investments, particularly in Queenstown in the first instance, to anchor the other end of the route, and then we'll look to fill other investment opportunities throughout New Zealand.
A question mark still hangs over Northland initially, with the single-track line not rated for passenger traffic. A longer-term goal is to have 2 trains operating in both islands without the need for them to cross on the ferry. The rebuild of the former commuter carriages is expected to be done in Dunedin, seen as a boost by the Mayor, Dave Cull.
They say they're intending to use hillside workshops which are largely mothballed. There is another business in there as well, a foundry, but they're largely mothballed. The stacks of room, and I'm sure the expertise is still there. And we've got the most photographed and beautiful railway station in New Zealand, so we're the perfect place for it to pull up.
The Antipodean Explorer will be a higher level of luxury than, for example, the Silver Fern rail car, on which afternoon tea required some engineering adjustments to the journey.
That buzzing was from the hostess to say that they're going to serve tea. When this occurs, we immediately slow down and proceed at a speed of about 40 kilometres an hour. And this is able to tea to be served in complete comfort.
But the luxury train will be the biggest step forward in long-distance rail travel since New Zealand had a series of liveried express trains throughout the country 30 years ago.
Take it easy, take a train.
I Tamaki Makoro mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Todd Nile tēnei.
If you're watching, those wonderful old New Zealand Railways commercials were from material preserved and made available from Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision New Zealand. Have we got Andrew Frey We got Andrew Frame on the line. Andrew Frame is joining us now from Hawke's Bay. Andrew, it's lovely to have you on Checkpoint. A bit of a 1-minute impromptu interview going into the 6 o'clock news. Once you hear the pips, just stop talking, Andrew, otherwise you turn into a pumpkin, as you know. But what did you see tonight after Mayor Bill Dalton told everybody in Napier to turn their hoses and sprinklers and all of that off? What did you see?
I went past McLean Park, which is my favourite cricket ground in the world, and sadly not having any cricket here because of drainage issues.
Yep.
I stopped and had a look with the test match going on and saw a sprinkler going.
And you've posted it on Twitter. And we're looking at it now. Thank you, Andrew. This is fine. Reporting from the spot. And it's green. That field is green, man. A lot of water has gone on that.
Oh, very much so. They were hoping to, of course, get it ready, do all the drainage and stuff and have it ready for England to be playing early next year. That's not going to be the case now because of too much rain in Auckland during the rest of the year, apparently, and being able to source sand and things like that. But, she looks as if she'd be good for a cricket match or 5.
Yeah, it's a lovely ground. Andrew Frame, thank you so much. So the sprinklers are on at McLean Park and Napier when the council have said, hey, turn your sprinklers off. It's 6 o'clock.
RNZ News at 6. Good evening, I'm Anna Thomas. Napier's water supply is critically low and residents are under strict warnings to observe restrictions. They've been told the city could run out of water as soon as tonight if the restrictions are not adhered to. The Mayor Bill Dalton told Checkpoint Napier has the highest water use per person in the country.
Sunday was a hell of a hot day here in Napier, and clearly people left their sprinklers on overnight, probably went out and put their sprinklers on in the afternoon and then went out for a barbecue and forgot about them. And we just had, instead of our reservoirs recharging, they actually ran down further overnight.
Bill Dalton. Meanwhile, dry conditions are threatening Otago irrigation schemes. The taking of water from the Tairi River has been stopped and restrictions have been imposed on 2 other rivers, the Pomahaka and the Kakanui, as they drop towards minimum levels. The Regional Council's Director of Environmental Monitoring, Scott McLean, says the dry conditions are happening about a month earlier than the drought 2 years ago when a water shortage was declared.
It's extremely dry, but there's very little in the way of snowcap to augment through snowmelt, which we often see at this time of the year. So that's something that usually holds the flows up. But if the dry and hot weather continues with no rain, it'll be a pretty grim season.
Scott McLean says almost all of Otago's main rivers are dropping quickly. The Director General of Health is stepping down early from the job. Chai Chua says his last day will be February the 2nd. The Health Minister David Clark has declined to be interviewed but says in a statement that leadership and relationships are key to the sector's success. Canterbury DHB member Jo Kane agrees. She told Checkpoint her DHB had rock-bottom relations with the ministry under Mr Chua.
What they do is they played winners and losers. As I said, if you were in, you won. So if you were on side with the ministry and everything, you got your funding. If you weren't, of which we happen to be one, but we're not the only one, you just hit a brick wall.
Jo Kane of the Canterbury DHB. The National Party says the debate over so-called work for the dole highlights how far apart the parties in government are. The Regional Economic Development Minister Shane Jones, who raised the idea, has admitted not all of his cabinet colleagues see eye to eye with him on it. And the Prime Minister said earlier today it will be up to Cabinet to decide how it would work. National's Regional Development spokesperson Simon Bridges says Mr Jones clearly thinks it is as simple as throwing a bag of pine seedlings at an unemployed person and sending them out into a field.
It requires drug and alcohol programs. It requires mental health programs alongside these. It requires just someone out there motivating these people every day. So it is quite complex, expensive work to move someone from unemployment into gainful full-time employment.
The National MP Simon Bridges. The new government is following through on its predecessor's plan to ban microbeads in cleaning and personal care products. Cabinet approved the regulations today and acknowledged the work of the National-led government which initiated the plan. The changes align with similar initiatives in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, France and Australia. An Auckland lawyer who continued to give legal advice despite being suspended has lost his career Anthony Banbrook was one of 3 directors of National Finance, which went into receivership in 2006, owing 2,000 investors more than $24 million, Edward Gay reports.
In 2013, Banbrook was sentenced to 8.5 months home detention for making an untrue statement in a prospectus. He was also suspended from practising for 7 months, but the Lawyers and Conveyancers Disciplinary Tribunal found that not only did he continue to give legal advice, he also pressured his client to withdraw the complaint. It noted he failed to turn up to the hearing where 5 charges of serious misconduct were proven. Banbrook has been ordered to pay $10,000 in compensation to the complainant and $56,000 in costs to the Law Society. The Society's president, Catherine Beck, says he showed a reckless disregard for the disciplinary process. I Tamaki Makoto ko Edward Gay aho.
The search for a 20-year-old Rangiora woman missing since late on Friday night will continue until sunset tonight. 45 volunteers and police are looking in and around the Ashley River near the town for Emma Beattie. The search and rescue coordinator for Mid-Canterbury, Phil Simmons, says there's nothing to indicate foul play.
Nothing suspicious that we can think of, but just really concerned for her safety. It's been 3 days now, and we haven't found anything of her or heard from her, so really keen for any sightings of her to be reported to the police.
Phil Simmons says the search is centred on the river because Ms Beattie often goes walking there. It's 6:05. The New Zealand cricket captain Kane Williamson says a strong batting display in the first test thrashing of the West Indies will give his team confidence for the second and final match of the series. The Black Caps only had to bat once to secure victory by an innings and 67 runs in Wellington today. Williamson says the batsmen should be feeling good going into the second test in Hamilton on Saturday.
To really put the runs on the board when we had the opportunity with the bat to get a long way ahead of the game by getting 500 plus with a number of contributions from all players in the order was, it's always a great thing going into the next game.
Kane Williamson. Meanwhile, England continue to struggle on day 3 of the second Ashes Test in Adelaide. A short time ago, they were 91 for 4 in reply to Australia's 442 for 8 declared. New Zealand has won every type of medal on the final day of the Track Cycling World Cup event in Canada. A young men's pursuit quartet came from behind to win gold. Ethan Mitchell finished second in the men's individual sprints, and Raquel Sheath and Michaela Drummond were third in the women's Madison. An attempt to demolish a former football stadium near Detroit has failed. Despite a series of controlled explosions, the Pontiac Silverdome, which once hosted a Super Bowl, is still standing. And that's the news.
This week on Nights, our engineer, Jeff Hunt, does the math on the government's plans to build 100,000 homes in 10 years. Matt Lowry from Transport Blog wonders if we've reached peak motorway. Anne Kerwin celebrates the ethical thinking of the enlightened Scot Francis Hutchison. And we'll wrap up the week with a Sonic Tonic dedicated to tearjerkers on Nights. Smoke Gets on the Radio with me, Brian Crump, after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
And now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight. Tomorrow, all the North Island mainly fine and warm, but isolated afternoon and evening showers from Taupo northwards. Also a few areas of cloud or fog tomorrow morning. Marlborough, Nelson, Buller, Northern Westland, Canterbury and Otago, mainly fine and warm, but isolated showers in Otago tomorrow afternoon. Southern Westland, Fiordland and Southland, patchy rain about Fiordland and Stewart Island, spreading elsewhere today. Now rain possibly heavy in Fiordland for a time tomorrow with a few falls elsewhere. And for the Chatham Islands, fine and cloudy periods. RNZ National, it's 7 minutes past 6 and you're listening to Checkpoint with John Campbell.
And Anna Thomas reading our news. Thanks so much, Anna Thomas. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for being with us. The Director General of Health, Chai Chua, has resigned this afternoon. David Clark, the Health Minister, announced that at 10 minutes to 5. Earlier this year, Mr Chua came under fire for his part in a funding allocation botch-up, which were almost $40 million incorrectly assigned to DHBs across the country. The president of the NZ Medical Association was hopeful the new Minister of Health would make changes. Pippa Mackay, in her June address to the Conference of General Practitioners, in fact, I think we spoke to Pippa after that, called for a clean-out of senior ranks at the Ministry of Health, describing them as manifestly incompetent. Dr. Pippa Mackay joins me now live from Christchurch. Dr. Mackay, it's great to have you back on the program. Thank you for being with us. What do you think of this announcement of Chai Chua's resignation?
Good evening. I'm obviously pleased because I've already expressed my concerns over his performance in the role that he had, and certainly as far as it goes for doctors, we didn't really feel that he was the right person for that job.
Why not?
Well, he was it felt as though the ministry was very disengaged from both the health sector and the people of New Zealand, the patients for whom they're supposedly are caring, really.
So I've heard that from the Canterbury DHB tonight. Joe Kane, who is a board member, has spoken to us. You're saying that, and you, I guess, are speaking on behalf of doctors. General practitioners were really overwhelmingly in agreement with you when you spoke at their meeting in June. But we've heard this from DHB after DHB. What was going on if Chai Chua was disengaged from the district health boards, the 20 district health boards, and some will say he wasn't disengaged from them, but overwhelmingly the majority have told us he was. Why?
I think that's something you should probably ask the previous Minister of Health. I mean, I don't think. I mean, I am certainly being critical of Chai Chua. I don't feel that he. Well, I guess that maybe that's what happens when you employ, a figures man to run a health ministry. I don't know.
Were the figures absolutely at the centre of this? In other words, was this around?
But if you get a bean counter to run a health ministry and he can't even count the beans properly, and there have been several instances where he has fallen short by millions in his estimates, then what was he doing there? There seemed to be a culture of I don't know whether. But not a culture of openness, not a culture of engagement. And certainly as a doctor, I felt most disengaged from my health ministry. But maybe part of that was the responsibility of the health minister as well.
If we look at the statement put out by the State Services Commissioner, Peter Hughes, and I read a bit of it to Joe Kane earlier in the program, but I'm just... I've had a bit of time with it because all of this has happened in the last hour. As Director General of Health, he has put the foundations in place to shift our health system forward. It is his view that having started the program, it is now time for a new Director General to accelerate and embed the changes. Do you want those changes embedded, or do you want to start from scratch?
I think that any good changes should be continued.
What were the good ones?
Well, I mean, I only heard about it. I've been in surgery all afternoon. I've only just heard about them, and I had a quick chance to read the statement that Peter Hughes put out. And there have been things in terms of electronic patient records and things like that I think are probably good initiatives. But that's not the only thing a health ministry is supposed to do. They're supposed to make policy and care for the people of the nation. And it's felt like maybe all of that electronic numbersy stuff is terribly important. And I don't doubt that on some levels it is important. But it's not felt a very kind of human face of a health system caring for people. That's what we at the coalface do, but I think that most New Zealanders want to feel that their health ministry cares about them and for them as well. And they have not been in the least bit engaged in that kind of way.
So Bob Simcock's gone last week, Chai Chua's gone this week, David Clark very, very quiet in terms of both announcements, short statements accepting their resignation effectively. Is this the Minister of Health at work?
I hope so. I mean, he was certainly, even though Jonathan Coleman didn't come to hear the speeches that the likes of me and Buzz Burrell gave at the GP conference, David Clark was there. He was certainly under no illusions.
So when you spoke at the GP conference, the previous minister wasn't there?
No.
So the disconnection, the disengagement you were talking about with Chai Chua and the ministry, was it matched by the previous minister?
Well, I think I've made it fairly clear in that speech that I felt that the health minister of the time, the previous health minister, was not particularly engaged with his sector.
So what do you hope for now?
I hope for a much more engaged health minister. I think the early signs are excellent. I think David Clark was at the meeting that we were when he was, shadow health minister, and so he was interested to hear what we had to say, and was engaged much more than I think that Jonathan Common was. But, he's new, and that's exciting for him, and I hope he does a great job. I think the early signs are good, and I think that he's taking a different look at things and a fresh look at things, and recognising there's been a lot of dissatisfaction from doctors, from, I'm sure, all health workers, but also from DHBs. And, I heard what Joe Kane said, and I think that for those of us in Canterbury, we felt greatly offended by the way the Ministry of Health has treated our DHB, of which we're all very proud.
That's Dr Pippa Mackay, New Zealand Medical Association President, joining us live to respond to the news that the Director-General of Health, Chai Chua, has resigned. Thank you so much, Dr Mackay. It is 14 minutes past 6. Earlier in the program, we spoke to Napier Mayor Bill Dalton, who's warning Napier residents to turn off the taps after an unusually warm weekend caused the town's reservoirs to reach a critical level. We're a bit surprised that critical came upon the town so fast. But the big dry isn't just threatening Napier's water supplies. Irrigation in central Otago is also under threat. The Tairi River dropped below its minimum allowed flow this morning, triggering a shutdown of irrigation permits. Restrictions have also begun on other rivers as they drop towards minimums in central Otago. Farmers getting nervous because the dry weather conditions are taking hold at least a month earlier than the region went into drought conditions 2 years ago. Our Otago Southern reporter Ian Telfer has the story.
Otago's been basking in the sun for weeks, but that's now taking its toll on farmers and the region's rivers. The Regional Council's Director of Environmental Monitoring, Scott McLean, says he's worried.
It's extremely dry, but there's very little in the way of snowcap to augment through snowmelt, which we often see at this time of the year. So that's something that usually holds the flows up. But if the dry and hot weather continues with no rain, it'll be a pretty grim season.
2 years ago, there was a farmer outcry in central Otago as an irrigation ban bit hard in a widespread East Coast drought. If it doesn't rain soon, this year could be worse. The area's main river, the Tairi, this morning triggered a minimum flow shutdown, and the Pomahaka in South Otago and Kakanui in North Otago are not far behind. Scott McLean says almost all Otago's main rivers are dropping quickly, leaving low flows at least a month earlier than in the last drought.
It's probably a little bit earlier this year than it was a couple of seasons ago. What we have seen, though, is the irrigation community, particularly in the Upper Tairi, have rallied together and organised themselves in response to this, and they're undertaking voluntary water rostering, which is excellent.
A long-time Patearoa farmer who chairs the Otago Rural Support Trust, Gavin Herlihy, says the heat of the past 3 weeks has been very unseasonal and very hard going.
I can't recall periods of week after day of near 30 degree temperatures, and that's been pretty taxing on the natural flow of creeks from the central Otago hinterlands, as well as now impacting on some of the major waterways such as the Tairi River.
There's a particular irony that the Tairi River, which did so much damage in July in its second highest flood on record, should now be running out of water. Gavin Herlihy says that's central Otago for you.
In the Maniapoto, there's an old saying, there's only a fortnight between the feast and the famine, and that's proving very, very true this particular year.
All farmers can do is wait and hope for rain, just when holidaymakers won't want it. I Otapoti, more Checkpoint, ko Ian Telfer, aho.
Ready to work or work for the dole? That, it seems, depends on whether you're talking to Labour or New Zealand First. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, insists the two parties are on the same page when it comes to plans to get young people into work, or ready to work, as Labour puts it. But Regional Economic Development Minister Shane Jones, New Zealand First MP, of course, admits not all his Labour colleagues see eye to eye with him on the proposal, which he has called a work for the dole scheme. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, Chris Bramwell.
It's not the first time that New Zealand First has pitched the idea of a work for the dole scheme. In 1998, a New Zealand First Minister in the National-led coalition government, Peter McArdle, managed to get a work for the dole scheme known as the community wage up and running. It didn't last long as it was scrapped by the Labour government when it took power. A 2001 assessment report obtained by the New Zealand Herald found that people on the Work for Dole scheme were 7% less likely than other job seekers to move off welfare within 2 years. The Regional Development Minister, Shane Jones, told TVNZ yesterday that he wants the government to give beneficiaries work and top up their dole payments to minimum wage levels.
I don't want people on the unemployment benefit. I don't want to have to rely on Filipinos to plant my pine trees, made to go to work, and where it's necessary to pay them, and they'll have to receive a minimum wage, but there'll be no more sitting on the couch.
National's Economic Development spokesperson Simon Bridges says Shane Jones clearly thinks it's as simple as throwing a bag of pine seedlings at an unemployed person and sending them out. He says National recognise that it's much more fraught and difficult than that.
It requires drug and alcohol programs. It requires mental health programs alongside these. It requires just someone out there motivating these people every day. So it is quite complex, expensive work to move someone from unemployment into gainful full-time employment.
Simon Bridges says the debate over the Work for Dole idea highlights how far apart all the parties in government are.
It's a real schmozzle. It's an incredibly divisive issue for the coalition. You've got NZ First on one side, you've got Greens at the absolute, you couldn't get a more polar opposite position, and then you've got Labour that I think certainly at the prime ministerial level tends more to that Campbell and the Green view of things.
But Jacinda Ardern says Labour and New Zealand First are on the same page.
We've called it Ready to Work. Minister Jones has talked about Work for the Dole. We're essentially talking about the same thing. The reason we've used a different title is some people have confused what we're proposing with the schemes of old, where an individual has worked only for their dole payment, but it's been a genuine job where legally they should be receiving a minimum wage.
Jacinda Ardern says any decisions about changing the sanctions regime would have to go through Cabinet.
We already have a sanctions regime in our welfare system, and that's provided us with the tools to ensure that people do take up the job opportunities that are available to them and do take up training. Now, my view is that sanction regime provides us the opportunity to achieve the outcomes we want, but I do want to take that to Cabinet for discussion.
A tau I te wharipari mata mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi nei, ko Chris Bramalaho.
But some Kaikohe locals say there aren't enough jobs in the small town for those living on the benefit to do. Our reporter Tom Furley is there.
Most young people are out of employment, and so they find their time doing things that they shouldn't do, like getting into drugs and breaking windows and stuff from shops in there. But there are some other people that are lucky to find work through like family connections and things like that. But I reckon if they just be like willing to get themselves out there and like just look everywhere, they'll find work. But some of them don't believe enough in themselves.
That's 17-year-old John Smith. He's been working as a painter for the past few months and says while his friends have all found work or moved away, people who go on the benefit tend to stay there. Another local, who asked not to be named, says often unemployment isn't through lack of trying.
It's standard, as soon as you finish school, if you're not going to university or you haven't got a job lined up, automatically you need to be on the benefit to support yourself. You can't live without it, Like I was on the benefit for a while. It wasn't my own choice. I wanted to work. I was trying to get out there. I was doing everything I can. I went to the WINS and asked them to help me, but they never helped me. They just put me onto a course, and that's all they do for the young people around here. They put them onto courses.
MP Shane Jones referred to his never-do-well nephews in Kaikohe when talking about his proposed Work for the Dole scheme. He says he wants people off the unemployment benefit and earning a wage. But Ruby Watson, who co-founded ACO, an architecture and design studio which works with young people in the town, says Mr Jones's message wasn't a welcome one. She says there just aren't enough jobs around and people aren't going to take to a different government scheme.
People are going to take to something that's innovative, that's designed by them, for them, and they don't want to be told what to do by someone who has seemingly become ungrounded in where they're from and dismissed his nephews, or his neffs, as he said, as being layabouts. Like, why would you listen to a scheme curated by someone who says something like that about you?
However, the head of the Kaikohe Business Association, Mark Anderson, says the idea of getting people off the couch and into work is just common sense.
There has to be an element of compulsion for a number of people, I guess, because otherwise you do what you've always done, get what you've always got. We have to do what we can to get these people into meaningful employment, because you and I both know that there's not only the pay in your pocket, but all those other intangible benefits that come from working versus not.
He says people can't be too picky about what they do, and there's an endless supply of work clearing up native forest and helping out with conservation. Shane Jones is overseeing a $1 billion regional development fund, with 4 projects expected to be announced before Christmas. From Kaikohe for Checkpoint, Tom Furley.
More jobs at NZ Post are on the line as it continues to shut branches in favour of franchises run out of shops like bookstores, pharmacies, dairies. Workers face redundancy at 3 Wellington Post shops, which will close in the next few months. Eric Frickberg reports.
There were long queues at the Manners Street NZ Post Kiwibank shop in central Wellington this afternoon. It's one of the outlets the union says will probably close in the new year. That means these customers will have to go elsewhere.
I think as long as the franchises and other stores are properly equipped and staffed with people who know what they're doing, then it could work.
I use this one all the time, so that would be a bit of a shame if this one shut down.
To be honest, the effect would be very minimal. I don't use those services very much. I literally was just dropping something into the parcel box.
NZ Post's aim is to replace self-contained shops like this and others in Kilburney and Featherstone Street with a franchise arrangement. Under this scheme, part of an existing store will be used for post business under a kind of dealership arrangement with NZ Post. Joe Gallagher of the ETU union says this process has been going on for 3 years and over 500 people have been made redundant so far or been moved on to other work.
These generally have been good, well-paid jobs with reasonable remuneration attached to it. So we're just trying to do our best to support those people to ensure that they get what's owing to them, and where we can, make sure that they keep a job if that's indeed possible.
NZ Post says contracting out work makes economic sense. For instance, partnership shops are chosen for their prime location. Many of the new sites are already bookshops or pharmacies with good foot traffic. A senior company executive, Janet Selwood, says 750 of 883 Post outlets have already been franchised, and this could happen to all of them in the end.
It's a possible scenario. We're going to continue with our program of moving across to a hosted model. How many of them actually get transferred across will just depend on a case-by-case basis, because we look at each community as we do it and decide what is the best outcome for our communities.
There was one customer at the Manor Street Post shop who thought the changes would be a bad deal for the staff there.
I was just in there now and I was queuing for about 15 minutes. Obviously they're understaffed as it is, and the poor people working there at the moment are, working. There's not enough staff. They're working harder than they should be.
The union's Joe Gallagher says what's happening now goes back to the national government relaxing the rules that required a set number of NZ Post branches to be retained. At around the same time, the New Zealand Super Fund and ACC bought into Kiwibank, which then began charting its own course. Mr Gallagher says if people are upset now, they should have done something 3 years ago. For Checkpoint, Core Eric Frickberg, 10A.
Pip has just told me in my earpiece that Dunedin is hotter than Noosa at the moment. I think we should all dwell on that for a moment. And climate change deniers, that's the end of the argument, really. You can never speak again. 26 minutes past 6, the imminent sale of a prominent New Plymouth landmark acquired under the Public Works Act in the 1930s is upsetting Taranaki Māori. Chorus has put Blagden Hill, or Maungaroa, on the market, but Māori say the company should have spoken to them first. Our Taranaki Whanganui reporter Robin Martin has more.
The New Plymouth Council bought Maungaroa, also known as Windy Point, from Te Kahu Heramaia of Te Aotearoa for a reservoir that was never built. It was subsequently used for telecommunications, and Chorus took over ownership of half the hill when Telecom split in 2011. Chorus is now selling about 2 hectares, not required for its core operations. Taranaki iwi member Dennis Naferi says the company should have contacted Māori about its plans.
The thing is that Chorus has inherited this land from Telecom and inherited it from various other agencies going all the way back to 1935. My understanding of the Public Works Act at the time was that if land was considered surplus to requirements, it was to be offered back to the descendants.
Dr Naferi says Te Kaho would have had little choice but to sell the land in the 1930s.
Te Kao was paid for the hill. However, as is very evident when looking through history at the Public Works Act, it's more than likely that he had no choice but to sell. Generally, Māori land at that time was considered open slather for development.
Dennis Naferi says Maungaroa was settled by the Opotiki Tawa hapu, and there are numerous wahi tapu and archaeological sites on the hill. He would like to see it turned into a reserve. In a statement, Chorus says Maungaroa does not appear on the first right of refusal list negotiated as part of Te Aotearoa's deed of settlement. and it considers any claim or interest in the land would have been registered at the time of treaty settlement negotiations. But the cultural advisor of Ngāti Te Whiti Hapu of Te Atiawa, Shane Cassidy, says it wouldn't have taken much to discover the hill is primarily considered Taranaki iwi land.
Been about an hour or so with us or with whoever, especially around finding the landowners of that historical site, Te Mangaroa, and to engage, and then hopefully that something can come out of it for both sides, for both parties, for the redevelopment of that the beautiful hill of Mangaroa.
Mr Cassidy says earlier archaeological surveys had discovered significant sites on the hill.
With the hapu of Ngāti Te Whiti, there is a concern that the wāhi tapus, we're going to dig deep again and look around and make sure that there is nothing still there that belong to Ngāti Te Whiti people.
Down at the Blagden shops in the shadow of Mangaroa, most shoppers wanted it to become a reserve.
In Auckland, you've got all the volcanoes as parks. That could stay as a park too.
Maybe a walkway, a track, something like that everybody can use.
It'll probably be subdivided, but I don't think it should go to a iwi as of right.
Well, I don't think they should be allowed to sell it for a start.
I reckon the iwi should have the first right buyback.
I'd like to see a lot of native trees up there because we need the birds to come back.
Access Radio Taranaki has operated rent-free from the site for 7 years, and Chorus has offered to sell the land to it. But its manager, Alessandra Keeley, says it doesn't have the money and wouldn't want to trample over any Māori aspirations for the site. The council has no plans to sell the 2 hectares of the hill still in its possession. I ngā mutu mō te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Robin Martin ahau.
Robin Martin, who does a fantastic job from Taranaki Whanganui, ending Checkpoint for tonight. Thank you for being with us on behalf of our wonderful team. Have a great evening. We'll be back tomorrow at 5.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Napier's water supply is critically low and residents have been told the city could run out of water as soon as tonight. And dry weather is closing down irrigation schemes in North Otago. The Senior Doctors Union says it's not surprised at the resignation of the head of the Health Ministry, Director General Chai Chua. And the new government is following through on its predecessor's plan to ban microbeads in cleaning and personal care products. Our next news and weather at 7.
New Year's Day, a brand new year. The sun is shining. Time to ponder new beginnings whilst tuning into RNZ Concert to hear your favourite classics in settling the score.